Welcome, the anointed ones. Never underestimate a person who has finally become tired of being underestimated. Because there is a particular kind of shock that happens when people think they have already figured you out. And then life forces them to watch you do something that does not fit their explanation of you. That is where the meltdown begins. Not just surprise, not ordinary confusion, a complete mental system crash. Suddenly the same people who once spoke about your future, as if they had personally seen the ending, are staring at the result like, wait, hold on, how did this happen? And the funniest part is that they start searching for explanations that protect their old opinion of you. It was luck. They got help. They must know somebody. They were in the right place at the right time. And sometimes the excuses become so creative, you almost want to sit back and congratulate them for the effort. But here is a fascinating fact. People are naturally uncomfortable when evidence strongly contradicts a belief they have held with confidence. Psychologists refer to this tension as cognitive dissonance. And that is exactly what can happen when someone has spent years believing they know your limits, only to watch you produce a result their old version of you cannot explain. Because the real shock is not always that you succeeded. It is that you succeeded in a way they cannot reduce, dismiss, or trace back to the story they created about you. They had already decided how far you could go. They had already measured your weaknesses. They had already watched your failures and quietly turned them into predictions. Some even became so comfortable with your old struggles that they started treating them like permanent features of your personality. But while they were studying your past, you were studying your possibilities. And that is the part nobody saw coming. You did not necessarily become louder. You did not spend every day making announcements. You did not gather a committee to inform everyone that you were about to change your life. You simply started correcting things. One decision, one habit, one boundary, one skill, one uncomfortable truth at a time. And while they were still confidently explaining why you would remain exactly where you were, something was changing underneath the surface. Your discipline was getting stronger. Your thinking was becoming sharper. Your standards were rising. Your tolerance for nonsense was quietly dropping through the floor. And then one day, the preparation finally met the opportunity. Boom. Now everybody is doing mathematics with your life. Wait, how long has this been happening? When did they learn how to do that? Who helped them? Why didn't we know? Exactly. Why didn't you know? Because not everything important happens in front of an audience. Some transformations are invisible while they are being built. The world only notices them when they become impossible to deny. And that is what makes this story so powerful. You did not just surprise people. You forced them to confront the possibility that their understanding of you was deeply, embarrassingly outdated. They were still judging you by a version of yourself that had already expired. They were reading an old map while you were building an entirely new territory. And now comes the moment they cannot handle, trying to explain how you pulled off something they were emotionally committed to believing you could never pull off. So today we are going deep into the reasons why people completely lose their minds trying to explain your transformation, your comeback, your unexpected success, your recovery, and the version of you they never saw coming. Because sometimes the greatest shock is not that you changed. It is realizing that you were changing the entire time, and they were simply too busy underestimating you to notice. Number one, you escaped the role they had already written for you. The truth is, some people had already decided who you were before you had the chance to fully become yourself. They gave you a role based on your mistakes, your background, your quietness, your past struggles, or the version of you that was easiest for them to understand. In their minds, you had a limit, a ceiling, a predictable ending. And they became so comfortable with that story that they stopped seeing you as someone still capable of changing. That was their mistake. You were never frozen in time. While they kept remembering who you used to be, you were slowly becoming someone they had not prepared their minds to recognize. The person they dismissed learned more. The person they underestimated became more disciplined. The person they thought would remain stuck quietly found another way forward. And when your life finally produced evidence they could not ignore, their explanation fell apart. They had to face something deeply uncomfortable. They were wrong about you. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. You did not escape their role because you fought endlessly to prove them wrong. You escaped it because you eventually stopped living according to a script you never agreed to. And once you started writing your own story, the character they thought they knew disappeared from the page. That is why they are confused. They are still waiting for the old you to come back, while the new you has already moved on. Number 2. Your recovery made their explanation look ridiculous. They thought what happened to you had changed the ending. They saw the setback, the disappointment, the loss, the delay, and quietly decided that you would never fully recover from it. In their minds, that chapter became your definition. They expected you to carry the damage into every future decision. They expected fear to make you smaller. They expected the pain to permanently reduce what you were capable of becoming. Then you recovered. Not perfectly, not instantly, but deeply enough to make their entire explanation of you look foolish. The truth is, people often misunderstand recovery. They think recovering means returning to exactly who you were before life hit you. But you did something far more dangerous to their expectations. You learned from what broke your old way of thinking. You became harder to deceive, more careful with your energy, more aware of your value, and less willing to collapse every time life became uncomfortable. That is why they could not explain what happened. They had calculated your future using the worst moment of your past. But you did not stay there long enough to become their prediction. You carried the lesson without carrying the identity of the person who was hurt. And when you eventually stood stronger than before, they were left staring at the evidence, trying to explain how the same experience they thought would finish you somehow became part of what rebuilt you. That is when their logic completely fell apart. Number 3. You used the damage as information instead of an identity. Something happened to you, and for a while it may have looked like it had the power to rewrite your entire life. Pain has a strange way of demanding attention. It can make one moment feel bigger than everything that came before it. Many people never escape that trap. They keep returning to the same wound, the same betrayal, the same failure, until it becomes the main thing they know about themselves. You did something different. You started asking what the experience was trying to teach you. The disappointment showed you who was unreliable. The failure showed you where you were unprepared. The betrayal exposed the warning signs you ignored. The rejection revealed where you had been seeking approval from the wrong people. You did not call the pain a blessing. You did not pretend it was enjoyable. You simply refused to waste it. That was the turning point. Instead of carrying the damage as proof that you were broken, you carried the information as proof that you had learned. You stopped building your identity around what happened and started building wisdom from what it revealed. And that is why they cannot understand you now. They expected your past to keep controlling your future because they were still judging you by the wound. They never expected you to take the lesson, leave the label behind, and keep moving. You did not deny the damage. You simply stopped letting it introduce you. Number 4. You stopped trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. One of the biggest turning points came when you realized that some people were never confused about you. They simply preferred the version of you they had created in their minds. No matter how clearly you explained yourself, they found a way to twist your words. If you defended yourself, you were too defensive. If you explained your side, you were making excuses. If you pulled away, you were acting different. It was a game you could never win because they had already chosen the conclusion before you even spoke. So you stopped wasting your energy. You stopped giving long explanations to people who had no intention of understanding. You stopped trying to make every decision look reasonable to those who benefited from doubting you. You stopped handing out pieces of yourself just to keep others comfortable. And that changed everything. The moment you no longer needed their understanding, you became free to focus on what actually mattered. Your energy went into building instead of defending. Your time went into moving forward instead of clearing your name. And without constantly carrying the pressure of other people's opinions, your mind became sharper. That is why they became even more confused. They thought you were silent because you had no answer. The truth was far more powerful. You had answers. You simply realized they had not earned them. Number 5. You changed in a way that couldn't be traced back to one big moment. That is what made your transformation so difficult for them to explain. They kept looking for the big event, the one opportunity, the one person, the one decision, the one lucky break that suddenly changed everything. But there was no single moment they could point to. The truth was far less dramatic and far more powerful. You changed through small decisions repeated when nobody was paying attention. You started noticing what was draining you and quietly removed it. You became more careful about what you accepted. You learned things you once ignored. You became disciplined in places where you used to be inconsistent. You made tiny corrections that seemed unimportant on their own. And because nobody was watching closely, nobody understood what was happening. That is how real change often works. It does not always arrive with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it hides inside routines. It grows through better choices, uncomfortable lessons, repeated effort, and the decision to stop returning to what no longer serves you. Then one day, the difference becomes visible, and suddenly, people act as if you changed overnight. They did not see the days you corrected yourself. They did not see the moments you chose growth over comfort. They only noticed the distance between who you were and who you became. So now they keep asking what happened. What happened was simple. While they were waiting for a big moment, you were quietly changing your entire life, one decision at a time. Number 6. The very traits they dismissed became your greatest advantage. The funny thing about being underestimated is that people often reveal exactly what they failed to understand about you. They saw your quietness and called it weakness. They saw your independence and called it stubbornness. They saw your careful nature and assumed you lacked courage. They judged the trait without understanding what was underneath it. Then life changed the context. Your quietness became observation. Your independence became self-reliance, your patience became timing, your ability to step back became clarity. Even the fact that you did not rush to follow everyone else became an advantage because it gave you room to think before making decisions. What they criticized became part of what separated you from the crowd, and that is where their explanations started falling apart. They had measured your qualities according to how useful they were to them, not according to what those qualities could eventually produce in your own life. They wanted you to be louder, faster, more available, and easier to predict. But you did not need to become someone else to move forward. You needed to understand yourself better. That is the part they missed. Your greatest advantage was not necessarily something new you acquired. It was something you already possessed, but had not yet learned how to use properly. So when the results finally appeared, they called it unexpected. It was never unexpected. They simply misunderstood the person they were looking at. Number 7. You succeeded without becoming the person they expected success to require. They had a formula for what success was supposed to look like, and you did not follow it. In their minds, you needed to become louder, more aggressive, more connected, more visible, or more willing to play games. They assumed that if you refused to become like certain people, you would never reach the level you wanted. Then you proved something they did not expect. You could grow without abandoning yourself. You did not need to copy somebody else's personality. You did not need to chase every trend or turn your life into a performance. You learned what worked for you and became better at using it. You improved your skills, strengthened your discipline, corrected your mistakes, and became more intentional about where you placed your energy. That is what made your progress difficult for them to explain. They were looking for the secret ingredient in everybody else's recipe. Meanwhile, you were quietly improving your own. And perhaps the biggest surprise was that you did not have to become cold, arrogant, or ruthless to become stronger. You simply became more selective. You learned that confidence does not require constant attention, and ambition does not require stepping on everyone around you. Your success challenged their assumption that there was only one acceptable way to win. You did not beat the system by becoming someone else. You beat their expectations by becoming a stronger version of yourself. Number 8, you took back the power of being unpredictable. People become comfortable when they think they know how you will react. They learn your triggers, your habits, your weaknesses, and the things that can pull you back into old patterns. Once they believe they have figured you out, they stop paying attention to who you are becoming. Then you changed the pattern. You stopped reacting automatically. You started thinking before responding. You stopped making decisions simply because someone expected you to. You became willing to disappoint people who had become dependent on your predictability. That shift is powerful because unpredictability, when it comes from self-control rather than chaos, gives you freedom. You no longer have to follow the script someone else prepared for you. If they expect you to argue, you can walk away. If they expect you to chase, you can keep moving. If they expect you to remain where they left you, you can choose an entirely different direction. And suddenly, their old understanding of you becomes useless. They cannot control a reaction they can no longer predict. The most interesting part is that you did not become unpredictable by trying to confuse anyone. You simply stopped allowing other people's expectations to make your decisions for you. That is a completely different kind of power. You became harder to manipulate because you became more deliberate. They thought they knew your next move. You finally realized your next move belonged to you. Number 9. You learned to let confusion work in your favor. There is a strange advantage in no longer rushing to correct every wrong assumption people make about you. Not every misunderstanding deserves your energy, and not every person deserves access to the full explanation behind your decisions. You eventually learned that constantly explaining yourself can become another form of distraction, so you stopped doing it. When people assumed you were lost, you kept working. When they thought you had nothing happening, you kept preparing. When they misunderstood your direction, you allowed them to keep guessing. You discovered that people can spend enormous amounts of energy trying to solve a situation they do not actually understand. And while they were analyzing you, you were improving yourself. That became the beautiful irony. Their confusion created space for you to operate without unnecessary attention. You did not have to announce every move, defend every decision, or reveal every plan before it had time to develop. You simply allowed your results to arrive before your explanations. This was not about playing games or deliberately misleading anyone. It was about refusing to make other people's curiosity your responsibility. Eventually, the results spoke for themselves. The people who thought you were doing nothing suddenly had explanations to invent. The people who underestimated your direction suddenly had to reconsider it. and those who were certain they understood you discovered that certainty had been their biggest mistake. Sometimes the smartest response to being misunderstood is not a better explanation. It is better results. Number 10. You reached a level where your old reputation could no longer contain you. There comes a point when the person people remember and the person you have become are simply no longer the same. The problem is, some people keep interacting with your old reputation long after you have outgrown it. They remember your mistakes, your awkward seasons, the things you struggled with, the moments when you lacked confidence or did not know what you know today. They stored those memories like permanent evidence and assumed they would always explain you. Then your life started producing different evidence. You became more capable, more disciplined, more selective, more confident in your decisions. You stopped repeating patterns that once held you back. Suddenly, the old description did not fit anymore. And that can be uncomfortable for people who had become attached to their version of you. They may still bring up who you used to be because the present version gives them nothing useful to criticize. The old story is familiar. Your growth is not. But you cannot keep shrinking yourself just to make an outdated reputation feel accurate. Eventually, reality becomes louder than memory. Your actions begin contradicting the labels. Your consistency challenges the old assumptions. Your progress forces people to update their mental picture of you, whether they want to or not. That is when the real shift happens. You did not spend all your time repairing your old reputation. You built a life so different that the old reputation simply stopped making sense. Number 11. You didn't defeat their opinion, you made it irrelevant. There is a major difference between proving someone wrong and reaching a place where their opinion no longer determines how you see yourself. At first, you may have wanted them to understand what they got wrong. You wanted the apology, the recognition, maybe even that satisfying moment when they finally admitted they had underestimated you. But something changed. You stopped needing the verdict. Their criticism stopped being fuel. Their approval stopped being a reward. Their doubt stopped being a challenge you had to answer. You became busy building a life that did not require their permission to make sense. That is when their influence disappeared. Because proving someone wrong still keeps you emotionally connected to their judgment. You are still measuring your progress against their expectations. But making their opinion irrelevant means you have moved the measuring stick entirely. Now your standard is different. You judge yourself by your growth, your discipline, your choices, and the direction of your life. Someone can misunderstand you, and you can continue moving. Someone can dislike your decisions, and you can still sleep peacefully. Someone can maintain an outdated opinion, while reality keeps proving that opinion less important every day. And strangely enough, that is often when people notice you most. The person they once thought they could define is no longer asking to be defined. You did not win because they finally admitted they were wrong. You won because their admission stopped mattering. Number 12. Your timing destroyed their entire theory about you. People are often confident about someone's future when they have only seen a few chapters of their past. They saw your delays and called them permanent. They saw opportunities pass and assumed you had missed your chance. They watched you struggle and quietly turned a temporary season into a permanent prediction. Then your timing changed everything. You did not succeed when they expected you to. You did not suddenly become impressive when they were still cheering for you. Your breakthrough came after some people had already become comfortable with their opinion of you. That is what made it so difficult for them to process. They had already closed the case. In their minds, the evidence was complete. Then something happened that their conclusion could not explain. You moved forward. You improved. You reached something they believed was beyond your reach. And suddenly, they had to revisit everything they thought they knew. That is the strange power of timing. A result arriving late does not automatically mean the effort was wasted. Sometimes the delay gave you time to develop the skills, judgment, and maturity needed to handle what you were pursuing. You were not necessarily behind, you were becoming ready. While they were measuring your progress by a calendar, you were building capacity they could not see. So when the result finally arrived, it looked sudden to everyone watching from the outside. They thought your delay was evidence against you. Time eventually turned it into evidence that they had judged you far too early. Number 13. You did the work nobody thought you had the discipline to survive. The part people rarely understand about remarkable results is how ordinary the process can look while it is happening. They notice the achievement, but they do not see the repetition behind it. They see the finished product and somehow forget that consistency was built on days when motivation was nowhere to be found. That is where you separated yourself. You kept working when nobody was applauding. You kept learning when progress felt painfully slow. You corrected mistakes instead of protecting your pride. You returned to the task after disappointing results instead of using one bad outcome as an excuse to quit. And that kind of discipline is difficult to fake. Talent can attract attention quickly, but sustained effort reveals something deeper. It shows that you can keep your word to yourself, even when there is no audience keeping score. People who underestimated you often saw your starting point and assumed they knew your destination. They did not account for what could happen if you remained consistent long enough. That became their mistake. You were not necessarily the most gifted person in the room. You simply became increasingly difficult to stop because you kept improving. Then the results arrived, and suddenly everyone wanted an explanation. They looked for a shortcut, a connection, some hidden advantage. But the answer was sitting in plain sight. You did what most people admire from a distance, but struggle to do consistently. You kept showing up long after the excitement disappeared. Number 14. The real meltdown began when they realized you had been preparing without their permission. The biggest shock was not the result. It was discovering that the result had been developing long before anyone noticed. They thought your lack of announcements meant a lack of progress. They assumed that because you were not constantly talking about your plans, nothing serious was happening. They were wrong. While they were forming opinions, you were building skills. While they were discussing your limitations, you were correcting your weaknesses. While they were waiting for you to make another mistake, you were learning from the ones you had already made. Nobody gave you permission to improve. You did not need an audience to become more disciplined. You did not need everyone to believe in your ability before you developed it. You simply started taking yourself more seriously. And that is what eventually became impossible to ignore. When the opportunity arrived, you were ready for it, because the preparation had already happened. To everyone watching from the outside, it looked sudden. To you, it was the result of countless small decisions that had been accumulating quietly. That is why their explanations started falling apart. They were looking at the final result and searching for a dramatic reason behind it, completely unaware of the ordinary work that created it. They called it luck because they missed the preparation. The real surprise was never how you pulled it off. It was how long you had been preparing before they realized you were serious. And when you put everything together, you begin to see why they had such a hard time explaining how you pulled it off. You escaped the role they had written for you. You recovered from things they thought would define you. You turned painful experiences into wisdom instead of allowing them to become your identity. You stopped exhausting yourself trying to convince people who had already decided to misunderstand you. You changed through countless small decisions, turned traits they dismissed into strengths, and succeeded without becoming a copy of anyone else. You became unpredictable because you stopped letting other people's expectations make your decisions. You learned that confusion does not always require an explanation. Your old reputation eventually became too small for the person you had become. Their opinions lost their power. Your timing exposed how premature their judgments had been, and behind everything they could finally see was something they never witnessed. The discipline, learning, and preparation happening when nobody was paying attention. That is the part they cannot easily explain. They saw the outcome. You lived the process. They saw the moment everything changed. You remember every small decision that led there. So if people are suddenly struggling to understand you, do not feel pressured to shrink yourself back into an explanation that makes them comfortable. Growth does not need to remain recognizable to people who only knew your past. Sometimes the most satisfying answer is not an argument, an announcement, or a dramatic comeback. It is simply continuing to become someone your old limitations can no longer describe. And if this message spoke directly to where you are right now, make sure you stay connected to the channel. Subscribe, turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one, and give this video a like if you found something here that genuinely made you think. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell us which point hit you the hardest, because someone reading your comment may be going through the exact same transformation. Finally, share this video with someone who needs the reminder that being underestimated is not the same thing as being incapable. Keep growing, keep learning, keep building, and most importantly, never let someone else's outdated version of you become the limit of your future. God bless you.